also presented last year. He has been involved with the development of DFUGs since probably more than 20 years ago, if I'm right, Martin.
Yeah, I started in '95.
Great.
So it's a while.
Perfect. So I'll let you introduce yourself, but yeah, you will guide us through the advanced e-signature techniques.
So
yeah, thank you,
you
Martin.
can see my slides, and you can see me, and you can see, okay, you can hear me. Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to talk about advanced e-signature techniques today. And just an overview, what we'll talk about is just what the requirements are for e-signatures, what the built-in DFdiscover e-signature functionality is, how we can implement signatures with edit checks, how we can track the state of e-signatures, how we can handle e-signatures that cover multiple pages, how do we ask for pages to be re-signed, and how do we automate some of these processes. So the first thing we'll start with is the requirements. So 21 CFR Part 11 says that the signature must contain the printed name of the signer, so it's their legal name, the date and time when the signature was executed, and the meaning why they're signing, so review, approval, whatever. It's required that they're subject to the same controls as electronic records. That is to say, you have to have a username and a password, for example. And then there's this little section at the bottom that they need to be linked to the respective data records. And we'll get to that a little bit later. So the built-in DFdiscover e-signature support has been there since probably 2014 or so. There's an e-signature module that provides all the fields, and you can sort of see it up on the right-hand side there. So you have the date, you have the name of the person, then you have two choices for reasons. One's a choice field, and the other one's a string field that you can type in custom messages, and then the time. So the tools automatically know what to do with these fields. So when you go into DF Explorer or DF Web or DF Collect, and you have the appropriate permissions, then when you sign off the record, it'll ask you whether you want to sign it and fill in those signature fields. So you need to have the P permission in your role, and after signing, any data change to the plate clears the e-signature. So if somebody else comes in and changes the data value, then it clears the e-signature. So that's totally automatic. There's no edit checks or anything required for that functionality. So some of the limitations of that is that if the CRF contains fields other than the ones that the signer is responsible for, then, as I said, any data value change to those fields will also clear the signature. So if you have Medra coding fields or SDV fields or hidden internal fields, and somebody comes along and does the SDV process and checks that they've done that, then that's a change to the data record, so your e-signature disappears. So one thing that DFnet could maybe think about adding is a property that allows you to exempt certain fields from triggering the clearing of the signature fields. Secondly, e-signatures only apply to the CRF that they're on, and this was a decision that we made when I was still working for DFnet, and that was that the signature would only be on the one page, and that has to do with the fact that you may not have permissions to see other pages. So if you have, let's suppose you have a baseline form that has 4 pages, and the signature is on page 4 of it, you may not have permission to see all of the other forms, and then it becomes very difficult to figure out when to clear the signatures and when to add them in. And another really rare case that's happened once in one study that I've been involved with is that there was one page that had 2 signatures on it, one for the investigator and another one for a medical expert to review the form. So it's only happened once, but there's just no way to support that functionality. So another way we can implement e-signatures is using edit checks. And in order to do that, we need to have the field for the full name, the reason for signing, and the date and time fields that the regulations require. We need to have a role that's allowed to sign. So the example code that I'm going to show you uses a role that I call ESIG. And I'm going to add some functionality that allows us to have a query put on signatures that need to be re-executed. So in the newer versions of DFdiscover, there's user-defined query types. So I've chosen query type number 31 because that was the next one that was available for me. And you'll see 31 and ESIG show up in some of the example code. So the first thing that we need to do, if we're going to use edit checks, is we need to make sure that people can't just willy-nilly change these things, right? Because they're controlled fields. So first thing you need is to have an edit check that makes those signature fields view only. And so that's a very simple edit check that just goes and makes those the name, the reason, and the time and date fields view only. And you want that edit check to execute for all users because you don't want anybody really to be able to make these changes. So the edit check is going to make it view only, and another edit check is going to fill in and manage the edit check. So the users can't do anything directly to these fields. Then we need to have an edit check that actually does the signing. And here's a simple example of what you could use. So there's a message that we're going to put up and just says, by signing, you're executing your electronic signature is equivalent of your handwritten signature. The first thing we're going to do is just see whether our role is in fact ESIG, which is the role that my example code uses for signing. You could, of course, have as many of these roles as you like. This is a simple, bare bones type of edit check, but if you had multiple roles, you could put them in there. Then we check to see whether the signature field is already been filled in. So in other words, it's not blank. And if it doesn't have an unresolved QC of type 31, which is what I'm using to mark that it needs to be re-signed, then there's really nothing to do. It's filled in and there's no query on it, so we don't need to do any re-signing. So we just do a return and we quit. And then I ask whether you want to e-sign now. So at this point, we've established that we have permissions and we have established that either the signature field is blank or it's been queried for a re-sign. So the next thing I'm going to do is ask whether you want to re-sign it now. If you say no, then the edit check aborts and continues. And if you say yes to that, then it's going to ask you for your password and it's going to display that message that's up at the top in red. If you get the signature correct, it's df password X is going to return a value that's greater than 0. So we go and fill in the user's full name, the reason. So I've hard coded that as reviewed by, but you could put whatever message you wanted in there, and then the date and the time field. There's df auto reason 0 and df auto reason 1. I've put that in because otherwise, if you change those fields, then they will turn green because the edit check will automatically put a reason on it. By turning off the automatic reasons, then they don't get all those reasons added unnecessarily. And then the last part of the edit check just checks and sees, hey, if we have an unresolved query that says you need re-signing, we're going to edit that query and we're going to change its status to 5, which means that it's resolved. So that's pretty much the bare bones function of an edit check that you can do for signing. You can implement this on field enter. So when the user tabs into the full name field, it will execute. So here's a diagram of the signature life cycle. So the first thing that's going to happen is people are going to enter data, and the signature is not going to be necessarily put on right away. It might be you have a data entry person, that's a nurse or somebody at the site that's entering it, and then you have your investigator applies a signature. So at that point, the signature is valid, so in green, and then you can make further changes to the data record if you like or not. If you don't make any further changes, then you're done. Your signature is green, it's valid, it's up to date, nothing else to do. But you could also come along and say, oops, I made a data entry mistake. and I need to correct something. And if that happens, then you change the data. And that essentially means that the signature is now not valid anymore because it's not applying to the current data. So in that case, I've got that red line that says we need to do something, which is looping back to the signature applied box. The investigator goes and applies a signature, and we can go around this loop as many times as we need. So the color coding you're going to see in a couple of slides down. So just kind of remember, red means we need to do something, yellow means the signature isn't there, and green means that's all is good. Okay, so the next question is, how do we know when we need to re-execute a signature, right? So we need to track when the fields covered by the signature are changed after the signature was executed. So if you're using the built-in functionality, that happens automatically for you because the signature fields are just going to get cleared automatically when the data changes. If you're using the edit check way, then there's at least two ways you can do it. One is you can have your edit check see whether any fields on the page have changed. And if they have, then you can clear the signature, or you can query it, whatever. You could use custom properties to see if a field is exempted. So if you have the SDV fields and you don't really care whether they get changed or not, because that's not something the investigator is really responsible for, that's somebody else's job or coding. So, but this doesn't really work for signatures that cover multiple plates, because there's no way to say, if plate 1 has a data change, I want to put a query on plate 4 to say that that signature is not valid anymore. So we need another way to do this, and that's where a program called SigTrack from the DF toolkit comes in, and it allows you to track the state of all the signatures. So what SigTrack does is it reads the audit history, and for each record that has a signature on it, it computes and reports on the status. So either it's never signed, has a current valid signature, has fields that were changed after signing, the signature was deleted. There's a couple of other statuses, the record was deleted or marked lost and things like that. Those are kind of minor statuses, but the important ones are it's never been signed, it's valid, or it's in need of resignature. So in order to do that, it needs to know where your signatures are in your study, and it uses a configuration file, which is a text file that you can create to identify which signatures exist, where they are in your study, which plates that signature covers, and which fields aren't relevant to the signature. So you can have a single signature covering multiple CRFs in the same visit. So the example of a baseline form that has 4 pages and you have a signature on the last page, then it would track all the changes that happen on plates 1, 2, 3, and 4. And you can tell it that there's non-relevant fields such as SDV, coding, internal fields, whatever. It can also track DFdiscover signature fields. There's nothing special about them that it can't deal with. So here's an example of a form. So it's an AE form that I've created. This is an eCRF, and it's the second page of the form that has the signature fields on it. So you can imagine that there's the page 1 has the rest of the AE type questions on it. So there's 3 modules: an AE module, an edit check e-signature module, and an SDV module. So the SDV module, in my case, I just have a date field when the SDV happened, and then the verifier's name, and there's an edit check that fills those in if you're an SDV user. If you're not an SDV user, then they're hidden by an edit check as well. So the site investigator that's putting the data, completing the form, wouldn't even see these SDV fields because they're not really relevant to them. The e-signature field has the required fields, so the legal name, the reason, the date, and the time, and the AE has all the things that you'd need for your AE. So the important things to know that the e-signature fields are in fields 24 to 27, and the SDV fields are in 28 to 29. So when we create a configuration file, we add lines like this. So we say we have a signature and we give it a name, and you can put in whatever you like there. And we tell it where that signature is in your study. So in this particular case, it's on plate 151. Plate 151 can repeat multiple times, so we don't really care what the visit number is. It was on fields 24 to 27. And then it covers plate 151, and we're going to tell it to ignore fields 28 to 29. So a configuration file can contain multiple signature definitions. We'll see that in the next slide. And it can also list multiple covered plates and ignored field lines. So if you do that, this is what it would look like. So if you have a baseline form that has 4 plates, then you could say it's a signature's name is baseline. It's on plate 4, visit 1, because it only appears once in your study. It's on fields 57 or 51, 54 to 57. It covers plate 1. There's no fields that are exempted, so there's no SDVs or internal fields on that one. Plate 2 has 1 field, 60, that we don't want to be relevant to the signature. Plate 3 has 2 fields, 41 and 53, and plate 4 has 58 to 61 that are not relevant. And then you see the second signature definition is the one that we just saw in the previous slide. So you can put as many of these as you like into the configuration file, and you hand this off to the SIGTRAC program. So to do that, you can do this as a report, or you can do this as a script. This is basically the minimal amount of stuff that you need to do. So it's going to run DF audit trace from the DFdiscover software. We're going to tell it what study we want to run the audit trace on. We're going to tell it we're interested in new records, and the date ranges from January 1st, 1990 to today. And we're going to send the output of DF audit trace into the SIGTRAC program from DF Toolkit. We're going to give it our configuration file, which is what we just saw on the previous page. And we're going to tell it where we want to put our Excel output report. So in this case, in the study directory, work esignatures.xlsx. And it's also going to create a DRF file for us, which we'll put in the DRF directory from the study, and we'll call that esignatures.drf. And then it just says, okay, it's done. That's the only thing that's going to appear when we run this report. So the Excel file that it generates is color-coded, as you see, and it has the patient ID, where the signature is, the visit, the signature plate, the description. This comes from your configuration file. The status of the signature, so it's okay, it's been removed, it needs a resign, or it's never been signed. The username that did the signing, when it was signed, and then if there's any changes to a signed form, it will tell you what plate and what field number and the description of the field that they're on, what the value was when the signature was executed, what its current value is, and who changed it, and when it was last changed. Now, these timestamps that you see here, the signed and the last changed, they're in server time, because if you have sites all the way around the world, you may have somebody signing in Africa and somebody in Seattle making a change. So we want the timestamps to be consistent. So this is whatever time zone your DFdiscover server is in. So I've got 4 patients here. Patient 2001 just had data entry with signing. So the investigator went in, entered all the data, and signed it. And in each case, there's 2 lines. One's plate 150, and the other one's plate 151. So plate 150 uses the DFdiscover built-in e-signatures, and plate 151 uses edit check based signatures, but otherwise the forms are exactly the same. So if you go and do your data entry and you sign it, then the state is the same. So both of them have OK signatures and the date that it was done. For patient 2002, we had data entry with signing, so same thing as what we had in the previous one, but then an SDV user came in and checked the SDV flag boxes. So In the case of the DFdiscover built-in signature, that means that the signature field would have been removed because it was a change to the form, which is why you see for patient 2002, plate 150, the signature was removed. But for the edit check based ones, the signature is still valid because the configuration file said we don't really care if the SDV flag fields get changed. So its signature is still marked as being status OK. In patient 2003, we have data entry with signing, and then I came along and I changed the data values on the form. So in both cases, they're red because something needs to happen. In the first case, the signature was removed, and in the second case, SIGTRAC has identified that the signature is still there because the field still it wasn't cleared, but it says that the signature is no longer valid and it needs to be re-signed. Otherwise, they're the same, so that the data changes were both the same. And the last patient is one that had data entry done, but the record was never signed, so they're in a yellow status. And the color coding essentially corresponds to what we saw in the signature life cycle page. So SIGTRAC also creates a DRF file. So why would we want one of those? We have this nice colorful Excel file. Why would we need a DRF file? Well, the DRF file allows us to quickly find the records that need re-signing, so all the ones that are in red. And we can either use this interactively in DFExplore, or we can feed it to DFbatch. And if we feed it to DFbatch, we could have another little edit check that applies queries that says, hey, we need you to re-sign this form. So if you're going to do the DFbatch approach, you need to make a dedicated role. So in this particular case, I've called a role called eSigQC. And then you need the edit check to only add the query when it's run as that user with that role. And the reason for that is we only want DFbatch to run or to apply these queries when it's being run with a DRF file as input. So we're only going to affect the records that are in the DRF file. And the way that I've chosen, and there may be other ways to do it, but this is the most obvious one to me. We only want this to happen for specific user, and we only want to use that user for this particular purpose. Because if we don't protect it with a special role, then every time you run a DFbatch and you apply your changes, it's going to apply them to all your signature fields, because there's nothing that's going to say, well, it only applies to the things in this DRF file. It's just going to apply to everything. And all of a sudden, you're going to have queries on all your signature fields, which is not what you want. OK, so a query for re-signing, the edit check would look something like this. So we're just going to make sure that we're only running in batch. We're only going to do something when we're running as the role eSigQC. So we can have a user for that has that role. That's a special purpose. We're only going to do something if there's actually an unresolved, or if there's an unresolved type 31 QC. And again, I've chosen 31. You can choose a different number if you like. There's already an unresolved QC on it, then we already have a query for it, so we don't have to do anything. And then otherwise, we'll check to see whether we have a resolved query. If we do, we're going to just edit it to make it unresolved again. And otherwise, we're going to add a query to that field. Again, both type 31s. And then the last little bit is we need, when we put a query on a field, if it's marked as final, we need to get it to get marked as incomplete. And there's a bug in DFbatch 5.4 that didn't reset the record status correctly. So it was possible to have a final record that had a query on it. So this last little bit where it says @t is equal to @t is just enough to confuse DFbatch into thinking that it needs to reevaluate the status of the record. And this will then cause it to make the status of the record incomplete. So this approach puts a query on this field, but you could also clear it out if you want. The only thing is your auditor may object to removing signatures, and that was that second little part of 21 CFR Part 11 that says that you're not supposed to excise to falsify electronic record by ordinary means. So I don't think removing them personally is falsifying the record, because you've made a material change to the record and the signature is no longer valid. But a safer way is probably just to put a query on the record, because then the original signature stays there and your auditors are happy. To apply these with batch, you can use a batch control file. You want to apply both the data and query because you're going to be changing the record status. The criteria is the input DRF is esignatures.drf, or whatever name you've decided to give your DRF file. And the only edit check we want it to run is this esigqc edit check, because that's the only purpose we have. You run this control file as a user that has this esigqc role, and it will add queries to those records that were read in the Excel file. So some other SIGTRAC features and limitations. So it can generate a priority file. And so last year I talked about a tool called an annotate CRF, and it allows you to color code fields based on priority. So you can have fields that are really important for the site to get filled out correctly, and things that are not as important. So the SIGTRAC file can create a priority file that you can use with the annotate CRF tool to show you which fields your configuration file thinks are signatures and which files it thinks should be ignored, so you can visually confirm that your configuration file is correct. It has an SDV mode, which can be used to track changes after source data verification. So this is essentially the same problem. What we're trying to solve here is we have a field or a series of fields that are completed, and then we want to know, did any other fields get changed after those fields were completed? So it's the same sort of problem that you have with SDV. So somebody comes in, fills out the form, somebody comes in, does the source data verification, checks that they've done that, and then somebody else comes in and changes the data fields. So now you need to know, well, I need to go back and source data verify it again. And so this tool can also be used to find those fields, and it'll also tell you which fields changed and what their values were prior and what they are now. So that's kind of helping you find the needle in the haystack. One limitation is that the SIGTRAC program can only track signatures that occur at the same visit as the plate containing the signature. So it's not possible to define a final signature page that covers all the data for a patient and have it track that. So that was a design decision made early on in the development of this program. So if you're going to have just one signature page that the investigator signs that says, yeah, I certify everything's correct, then this tool won't be able to help you. Okay, so in conclusion, so DFdiscover provides a couple of different mechanisms for implementing 21 CFR Part 11 compliant e-signatures. The SIGTRAC program that I've talked about today computes the current state of all the signatures and ignores fields or ignores changes to fields that are no longer or that are not relevant to those signatures. The Excel report that it produces shows you what the current state of each signature in your study is and color codes them so you can quickly zoom in on the ones that you need to deal with. The DRF file helps you find the signatures that need attention, and you can use that file with batch edit checks to apply queries to records that need to be re-signed. So this works for both edit check based ones and the DFdiscover ones, although the DFdiscover ones will be blank, so you could always find those another way.